Far out at the edge of Concord space, there was a colony that most star maps did not even bother to mark with a warning symbol. It did not need one. Every ship captain who traveled that far out already knew to leave it alone. The colony was called Meridian Hold, and it was where the young of many different species were raised together, kept safe from every war happening anywhere else in the galaxy. The law that protected it was older than any single member of the Concord. It said that no matter what happened between two warring powers, the young could never be touched, and neither could the sanctuary worlds built to protect them. Every species that had ever joined the Concord agreed to this rule before they were allowed a seat at the table. It was the one law nobody broke, because everyone remembered, in their own way, what had happened the last time somebody tried. Humanity had joined the Concord 2 generations ago. In that time, humans had built a reputation among the other species as capable traders and steady engineers, but not as fighters. Whenever a conflict broke out somewhere in Concord space, humanity almost always chose to stay out of it, sending supplies and doctors instead of ships and soldiers. Some species respected this choice. Others quietly decided it was proof that humans did not have the stomach for real war. Captain Daniel Cole did not care much what anyone else thought about his species. He commanded a small defense squadron stationed near Meridian Hold, a posting most officers considered dull. Nothing ever happened there. His days were spent checking supply routes and running drills nobody expected to use. He liked it that way. Years earlier, before this posting, he had seen enough of real fighting to know that a quiet post was a gift, not an insult, and he never complained about being given one. Down on the surface of Meridian Hold, Sergeant Owen Reyes spent his mornings walking the edge of the nursery district instead of patrolling a battlefield. Children from a dozen different species ran past him every day, laughing in languages he only half understood, chasing one another between buildings shaped like shells and open flowers. He liked this posting more than any he had held before. There was nothing here to defend against, or so everyone kept telling him, and after a while, he had almost started to believe it. Far away, inside the tall glass halls of the Concord Council, Dr. Grace Whitfield spent her days doing a very different kind of work. She was humanity's lead voice on matters of trade and defense, and for months she had been fighting a slow, frustrating battle to win humanity a stronger seat at the table. Most delegates treated her politely, listened to her arguments, and then quietly went on making decisions without her. Ambassador Felix Adler, who worked beside her, felt that sting even more sharply. He had spent years insisting that humanity's caution should never be mistaken for weakness, but outside their own small office, almost nobody seemed to believe him. While the council spent its time debating trade routes and mining rights, a very different kind of decision was being made much further away, aboard a Halkan Dominion command ship. The Halkan had spent recent years expanding along the edges of Concord territory, testing smaller worlds one at a time, folding weaker colonies into their empire through pressure rather than open war. Their commander in this region, a Halkan officer named High Overseer Threxel, had grown confident that nothing in this part of the galaxy could truly stop him. He had studied every Concord species carefully, and humanity's file was thinner than most. Cautious, restrained, unwilling to commit fully to a fight. To Threxel, the word restrained did not mean disciplined. It meant soft. For weeks, Threxel's scouts had been quietly mapping the space around Meridian Hold, noting the light defense presence, counting how few ships patrolled its skies. A sanctuary world guarded only by an old law and a handful of soldiers who had never fired a weapon in anger. In his mind, it was the perfect place to prove a point to the rest of the Concord, and to show everyone watching just how little the old rules mattered to a power willing to break them. None of this had reached Captain Cole yet. His scanners occasionally caught faint, unfamiliar signals at the edge of his patrol range, nothing more than background static most days. He logged each one, as he always did, and continued his rounds without a second thought. Down on the surface, Sergeant Reyes finished his walk through the nursery district as the light began to fade, waving goodbye to a group of children calling out to him in 3 different languages at once. He smiled and waved back, thinking, as he often did in the evenings, that this had to be the easiest posting in the entire fleet. None of them knew yet that somewhere beyond the reach of their sensors, ships were already moving toward Meridian Hold, carrying orders that would break the oldest rule in the galaxy, and quietly change what every other species believed about humanity forever. The message that started the attack was only 9 words long, and every one of them was a lie. It claimed that Meridian Hold was hiding smugglers who had stolen Hulkan cargo, and that the Dominion had the right to search the colony by force. No proof was ever offered, because none existed. The message was never meant to be believed. It was only meant to give High Overseer Threxel something to point to later, if anyone ever asked why he had done what he was about to do. The first ships appeared over Meridian Hold just after sunset, when the sky above the nursery district was still streaked with orange light. At first, the alarms sounded like just another drill, the kind Sergeant Owen Reyes had run a dozen times without ever expecting anything real to follow. He was already moving toward the nearest shelter point when the first strike hit the outer perimeter, and the ground shook hard enough to knock 2 children off their feet in front of him. There was no time to think about smugglers or accusations. Reyes scooped up both children at once and ran, shouting for the other caretakers to get everyone toward the underground shelters. The nursery district had never been built for war. Its widest paths were meant for small feet, not for soldiers carrying weapons, and every second spent finding a way through it felt like a second too long. Around him, teachers and caretakers from a dozen species were doing the same thing he was, pulling children away from windows, counting heads, refusing to leave anyone behind. The Hulkan ships did not slow down or hesitate once the first shots were fired. What began as a show of force turned, within minutes, into something far worse. Strikes landed near the nursery buildings themselves, not just the perimeter defenses, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the oldest law in the Concord was being broken in real time, in front of witnesses who would never forget it. Above the colony, Captain Daniel Cole received the distress signal less than 2 minutes after the first shots landed. He did not wait for confirmation or permission. His squadron broke formation immediately and burned hard toward Meridian Hold, arriving in time to drive off the Hulkan scout ships, but far too late to undo what had already happened on the ground. When Cole's own eyes finally confirmed what his sensors had been reporting, something in him went very still and very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before a person decides something they will never take back. On the surface, Sergeant Reyes emerged from the shelters into a nursery district that no longer looked like the place he had walked through every morning for months. He did not have the words for it yet, and he would spend a long time afterward trying to find them. For now, he simply kept working, helping caretakers count the children who had made it, and quietly, carefully, keeping track of who had not. News of the attack reached the Concord Council within hours, but it reached Dr. Grace Whitfield differently than it reached everyone else in the room. She had spent enough time studying old Concord history, buried deep in archives nobody else bothered to read anymore, to understand exactly what this attack meant and exactly what it was likely to trigger. While other delegates around her reacted with shock and confusion, asking how such a thing could have happened, Whitfield found herself thinking only one thought, over and over. They have no idea what they just did. Ambassador Felix Adler stood beside her in the emergency session, watching delegates from a dozen species argue about jurisdiction and evidence and next steps, as if this were simply another border dispute to be managed carefully over time. He said nothing for a long while, letting the noise wash past him, because he already knew that none of it mattered anymore. The law that had just been broken was not a border rule or a trade agreement. It was the one thing every species, even the ones who distrusted each other completely, had always agreed never to touch. Far above Meridian Hold, High Overseer Threxel received his own report from the retreating scout fleet. Damage confirmed. Message delivered. He read the casualty numbers without much reaction, filing the operation away as a success, exactly the kind of demonstration he had intended it to be. In his mind, humanity's response, driving off a handful of scout ships, only confirmed what he already believed about them. Cautious, restrained, unwilling to commit fully. He had no reason yet to think otherwise, and every reason to believe the rest of the Concord would simply absorb this loss and move on, the same way it always had whenever the Dominion tested its limits before. He was not entirely wrong that the Concord would be shaken. He was simply wrong about which species would be the one to answer, and how completely that answer was about to arrive. News in the Concord did not always travel through speeches and formal statements first. Sometimes it traveled through silence, and the silence that followed the attack on Meridian Hold was louder than anything the council chamber had heard in years. Delegates who normally argued over the smallest details of trade law sat without speaking, waiting for someone else to say what everyone in the room was already thinking. It was Elder Severin who finally broke that silence, and he did not do it the way anyone expected. Severin represented one of the oldest species in the Concord, a people who rarely spoke unless they had something worth saying, and who remembered history that most younger species had only read about in summary form. When he rose to speak, the room went even quieter than before. He did not talk about outrage or justice. He talked about memory, and about a law written so long ago that most delegates in the room had never once questioned where it came from, or why it had been written in blood the first time. Ambassador Felix Adler used that silence carefully. He stood and formally invoked the Concord's founding protection clause, the same clause Severin had just reminded the room actually existed, giving any species whose sanctuary world had been attacked the right to full retaliation, without requiring council approval first. Several delegates objected immediately, calling for patience, calling for an investigation, calling for anything that might slow the moment down. Adler let them speak. Then he reminded them, calmly, that the law did not ask for their permission, only for their memory of what they had already agreed to. Dr. Grace Whitfield watched the exchange from her seat, her attention only partly on the debate itself. She had spent the last several hours quietly reviewing older Concord records humanity had been given access to when it first joined, but had never had much reason to read closely before. What she found there explained something she had always sensed but never fully understood about her own species' place in the Concord. Humanity had entered the Concord already bound by strict, self-imposed restraint, a promise made before any other species asked for it. At the time, she had assumed it was simple caution. Now she suspected it had always been something closer to a warning label, quietly agreed to by everyone who mattered, and mostly forgotten by everyone who did not. While the council argued, word reached Captain Daniel Cole through channels that had nothing to do with formal Concord approval. Ships humanity had kept in reserve for years, vessels never fully registered with Concord intelligence, began moving from hidden depots scattered across human territory. Cole did not wait for the debate above him to finish before preparing his own fleet to move. He had learned long ago that permission granted after the fact was still permission, and that some decisions could not wait for a room full of careful people to feel comfortable making them. Sergeant Owen Reyes, still recovering from the attack days earlier, requested reassignment the moment he was medically cleared. He did not ask for a desk posting or a quiet recovery assignment somewhere safe. He asked to be sent forward, toward whatever was coming next, and his request was approved without much discussion, because by then very few people in the fleet were inclined to argue with him about it. Word of the growing human mobilization eventually reached High Overseer Threxel, carried to him through Dominion scouts monitoring Concord border traffic. He read the reports with something close to amusement. A handful of old ships, some unregistered vessels, a single squadron moving with unusual purpose. To him, it looked exactly like what he expected from a species with no real appetite for war, a show of motion meant to satisfy public anger back home without ever intending to follow through. He dismissed the mobilization in a single line of his own report, calling it a predictable and manageable response. He was not entirely alone in underestimating what was forming at the edge of Concord space. Several council delegates, watching the same reports Threxel was watching, quietly assumed humanity's fleet movement was largely symbolic as well, a gesture meant to satisfy grief rather than a genuine military campaign. Elder Severin did not share that assumption, and he said so plainly, though few in the room seemed willing to fully absorb his warning. By the time Threxel's report reached his superiors, humanity's fleet had already crossed the border into contested space, larger, better organized, and far more capable than any figure listed in a Concord intelligence file. Nobody outside a very small circle of human command had ever seen this fleet gathered in one place before. That was, in many ways, exactly the point. The Hulk and Border Fleet had faced surprises before, but never one shaped quite like this. When the first wave of unfamiliar human ships appeared on their sensors, the officers on duty assumed it was a sensor error, or at worst, a small escort convoy lost far from its usual patrol routes. Neither explanation survived contact for very long. For years, the Concorde's intelligence files on humanity had listed a modest defense fleet, mostly built for patrol duty and disaster response rather than sustained combat. Those files had never been entirely false. They had simply never been complete. What crossed into contested space that day included ships humanity had quietly developed and held in reserve for over a decade, never paraded in front of the Concorde, never offered as proof of anything, kept back the way a careful person keeps something in case it is ever truly needed. Captain Daniel Cole led that fleet personally, and he did not fight the way Halkan commanders expected a cautious species to fight. Halkan doctrine was built around limited engagements, calculated pressure, strikes meant to intimidate rather than destroy. Cole's tactics assumed none of that. His ships moved with total commitment from the very first engagement, striking supply lines and forward defenses at once, giving Halkan border forces no room to regroup or reconsider. It was not recklessness. It was the kind of planning that only comes from a species that had decided, long before this day, exactly how far it was willing to go if that decision was ever truly forced on it. Sergeant Owen Reyes was there for that first major engagement, assigned to a strike team boarding a disabled Halkan supply vessel to secure it rather than destroy it outright. He moved through the ship's corridors with a kind of focus his fellow soldiers had never seen in him before Meridian Hold. He was not reckless, and he never once lost the discipline his training had given him. But there was a steadiness in him now that had not been there when he was walking children through a nursery district months earlier. He did his job efficiently, secured the vessel, and made sure every Halkan crew member who surrendered was treated exactly as the rules required, no more and no less. Across Concorde space, other species watched the engagement unfold through shared sensor feeds and delayed reports, and their reactions varied more than anyone might have expected. Some delegates on the council were horrified at the scale of the human response, arguing loudly that this proved humanity had been hiding dangerous capability all along. Others, including several smaller species who had themselves been quietly bullied by Halkan expansion for years, watched with something closer to relief, and in a few cases, open gratitude. Elder Severin watched without much visible reaction at all, though those closest to him noted he seemed less surprised than almost anyone else in the chamber. High Overseer Threxel received the first casualty reports from the border engagement with a growing sense of confusion that slowly hardened into something closer to alarm. His officers had expected a symbolic gesture, a show of force meant to satisfy public anger without any real intention of sustained conflict. What they were reporting instead was an organized, disciplined campaign, moving with a speed and coordination that did not match anything in humanity's known military history. Threxel reviewed the reports twice, certain there had to be some error in the data, before finally accepting that there was not. It was only then that he began to understand the mistake he had made, though he was still slow to understand the full size of it. He had read humanity's restraint as a limit, a boundary the species simply could not cross even if it wanted to. What he was watching now suggested something else entirely. That restraint had never been a limit at all, but a choice, one humanity had been making quietly for years, and one it had just decided to stop making. By the end of the engagement, Halkan border forces were in full retreat, falling back toward their own territory in an attempt to regroup and reinforce their defenses. Cole's fleet did not slow down to celebrate the victory, and it did not stop at the border the way a purely defensive campaign might have. Orders came through from human command confirming what many in the fleet had already suspected. This was not going to end at the edge of contested space. It was going to end at the source of the decision that started it, and Cole intended to make sure of that personally. There is a kind of quiet that settles over a place right before something ends, and the space above the Halkan home system had never experienced it in quite this way before. For generations, Halkan citizens had watched their fleets return from border campaigns with confidence, rarely imagining a day when an outside power would bring the fight all the way home. That confidence did not disappear all at once. It simply grew quieter, day by day, as reports of the advancing human fleet kept arriving with fewer and fewer reasons for hope attached to them. Inside the Concorde Council chamber, the debate had shifted from whether humanity had the right to respond to whether anyone had the right to stop them now that they had. Several delegates pushed for intervention, worried that a full assault on a Hulkan home system would destabilize the wider Concord and invite further conflict elsewhere. Elder Severin spoke against that position more firmly than he had spoken on anything in recent memory. He reminded the chamber, once again, that the sanctuary law existed precisely because someone, long ago, had to pay a price severe enough that no one would ever be tempted to test it again. The Hulkan Dominion had chosen to test it anyway. In Severin's view, the Concord had no standing left to protect them from the answer. Ambassador Felix Adler and Dr. Grace Whitfield worked together through those final tense days to keep the Council from intervening, not through argument alone, but through careful, patient reminders of exactly what every species in that room had agreed to when they joined the Concord in the first place. It was slow, exhausting work, made harder by the fact that both of them privately hoped Captain Cole would show more restraint than the law technically required of him. Neither of them said that hope out loud to the other, but both suspected the other felt it too. Above the Hulkan homeworld, Captain Daniel Cole's fleet moved into position with the same discipline that had carried it across every prior engagement. Threxel had gathered what remained of his home defense forces to meet them, still convinced, even now, that scale alone might be enough to change the outcome. It was not. Cole's ships fought with the same total commitment they had shown from the very first strike, dismantling Hulkan defenses in a battle that Threxel would later describe, to the very few people who ever asked him about it honestly, as the moment he finally understood what humanity's restraint had actually been protecting the galaxy from all along. Sergeant Owen Reyes was part of the boarding force sent to secure key Hulkan command installations once orbital defenses had fallen. It was there, in the final hours of the campaign, that the story could easily have turned into something darker than it did. Reyes and his team found themselves in position to strike a civilian control center that had little remaining military value, a target some in his unit argued should be destroyed simply to remove any risk of resistance. Reyes refused the order, choosing instead to secure the building without firing a single shot into it, and ensuring every civilian inside was evacuated safely before Dominion officials were allowed to surrender the site formally. It was a small decision in the middle of a much larger battle, but it was the kind of decision that would later be remembered far more than the battle itself. High Overseer Threxel was captured personally within his own command center, delivered there not by chance, but because Cole had specifically ordered it that way. Cole did not deliver a long speech when the two men finally stood face to face. He said only that this had never been about conquest, and that the Dominion would keep every world it currently held, provided it accepted the terms the Concord was about to offer, terms that included full reparations to Meridian Hold and a formal, public reaffirmation of the sanctuary law Threxel had broken. Threxel accepted the terms within hours, not because he had any real choice left, but because the alternative, clearly demonstrated across every battle leading up to that moment, was no longer something he was willing to test further. Word of the surrender spread through Concord space almost as quickly as news of the original attack had, though this time, the reaction across most species was not confusion or fear, but something closer to a long, careful breath finally being let out. The war, if it could even be called that in the end, was over. What remained now was the much slower work of understanding exactly what had just been revealed and deciding what to do with that knowledge going forward. Rebuilding a place is always slower than breaking it, but Meridian Hold had more help this time than it had ever needed before. In the weeks after the Hulkan surrender, ships from a dozen different species arrived at the colony carrying supplies, engineers, and caretakers willing to help however they could. Some came out of genuine sympathy. Others came because they understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly how close their own sanctuary worlds had come to facing the same fate, and wanted to be seen standing beside the people who had answered for all of them. Sergeant Owen Reyes returned to Meridian Hold not long after the fighting ended, though he did not arrive as a soldier this time. He walked the same paths through the nursery district he had walked months earlier, past buildings still being repaired, past caretakers rebuilding routines that had been shattered without warning. Children who remembered him from before ran up to greet him the same way they always had, and for a while, he simply let himself be that person again, the soldier who walked the perimeter and waved back, rather than the one who had fought his way through a Hulkan command center. Within the Concord Council, the debate that followed the surrender was, in its own way, just as important as anything decided on the battlefield. Dr. Grace Whitfield used the moment carefully, not to demand special treatment for humanity, but to argue for something simpler and, in her view, far more lasting. A treaty that finally treated humanity as an equal voice rather than a cautious minor species to be managed politely and largely ignored. After months of resistance, the Council agreed, and the new terms were signed with far less argument than anyone had expected only a year earlier. Ambassador Felix Adler delivered the closing address at the treaty signing, and he did not use the moment to boast about the campaign or to remind the room of the Dominion's defeat. Instead, he spoke about restraint, explaining as plainly as he could that humanity's caution had never been born from fear, but from a promise the species had made to itself long before ever meeting another intelligent life. It was a promise never to use its full strength unless there was truly no other choice left. He told the Council that this promise had just been tested for the first time since humanity joined the Concord, and that it had held exactly as intended, no more force used than the situation required, and no less. Elder Severin, listening from his seat, offered no formal remarks of his own, but those near him noted that he inclined his head slightly at Adler's words, a small gesture from a species not known for showing much reaction at all. It was, in its own quiet way, as strong an endorsement as anything spoken aloud in that chamber. Captain Daniel Cole did not attend the treaty signing. He returned instead to his old, quiet post near Meridian Hold, resuming the same patrol routes and supply checks he had run before any of this began. When reporters from several Concord networks tried to reach him for interviews about the campaign, he declined nearly all of them, offering only a short statement to the few he could not avoid entirely. He said that he had done only what the situation required, and that he hoped no one would ever need him to do it again. It was not modesty. It was simply how he had always understood the job. High Overseer Threxel, stripped of his command and held under Concord supervision pending a formal Dominion inquiry, was reported to have said very little in the months following his surrender. The one comment attributed to him that spread widely across Concord news channels was short and strangely honest for a man who had lost so completely. He said that he had studied humanity's file carefully before the attack, and that the file had simply been wrong, not in its facts, but in what it failed to explain about what those facts actually meant. At Meridian Hold, once repairs were finally finished, the colony's caretakers unveiled a new marker near the entrance to the nursery district, listing every species that had helped rebuild the place after the attack. Humanity's name was carved into that marker alongside all the others, no larger and no smaller than any of them. But across the wider galaxy, in council chambers and border stations and quiet conversations between species who had once dismissed humans as too cautious to matter, that name was beginning to be spoken differently now. Not as the quiet species anymore, not as the one nobody worried about, but as the one every other species had quietly agreed, without ever needing to say it out loud again, not to test a second time.